What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 sequels that were frankly disappointing, at least in comparison to their original games. Now, I will say right off the bat, that doesn't necessarily mean that any of these games are something I would consider bad. I mean, a couple of them are, but at least in 2 cases, I think the game itself is pretty good to potentially great even. It's just that that experience simply wasn't a great follow-up to the original in some way, at least for me. Which is probably the other more obvious point. Obviously, these are merely my own opinions, but this seemed like the inevitable follow-up to yesterday's video about sequels that I really loved, and thus, here we are. To get this video started properly, we'll begin with perhaps I would say the most notable one, at least on my channel, that I would say is pretty well known I did not enjoy, and that was Dragon's Dogma 2. So I really enjoyed the first Dragon's Dogma. Obviously it was its own sort of janky experience, but I was very much so looking forward to the sequel, only to be let down by a game that in some ways feels like a step back when you take a look at anything besides the graphics. And while it does do some things I think were really fun, most of that is still just returning from Dragon's Dogma 1. Some of those returning features, though, are, as an example, a story that ultimately goes nowhere, even though it starts much stronger in this one. It has an incredibly disappointing back half, if you could even call it a half, really, and even now, almost a year after release, it's still suffering from some performance problems, even. So all of that, before you even start discussing things like how they trimmed back some of the skills that were available to you, the player, and I think you can kind of see why this game is sitting at mixed ratings over on Steam, for sure, because again, there are things that it does that I like. In many ways, I would say Dragon's Dogma 2, for me, really felt more like a Dragon's Dogma 1.5 at best, or even maybe a remaster of the original, as a lot of it, frankly, just didn't quite land for me. Which is what it's doing on a list like this. Though truth be told, there are not a lot of games that I am more disappointed in than Elex 2. So I realize this one may be a little bit more obscure for some people, but quite some time ago I reviewed the original Elex, and it was my first Piranha Bytes game. I loved Elex. It's a janky, weird mess, much like most of Piranha Bytes' works, admittedly, before they shut down, mind you. But by and large, I had a great time with Elex. That game really grew on me, and it was one of those games I was honestly kind of sad to put it down because there was just nothing left to do. So imagine my excitement when I learned that they're actively working on a sequel that is meant to be part of a grander trilogy. A trilogy we'll never get because, as I mentioned, they shut down, so Elex 2 is unfortunately where that ends. I mean, I guess technically THQ Nordic could do something with it, but I sincerely doubt we'll see that happen. But as you could obviously guess, Elex 2 was not a great sequel. The story is really bad. You get forced into a bunch of canonical decisions as it happens sometimes, but this leaves you with a kid. Your character is just by default a terrible father. They try to involve that kid in the story, and it's done very poorly. That's not even addressing the fact that for whatever reason, graphically this game looks a lot worse than the first game, which may be down to like an engine swap or something. I'm not exactly sure what happened there. Most of it looks fine, but every once in a while it's just like, man, this does not look good at all. And then moving from 1 to 2, it's another game that just barely did anything new to begin with. I mean, off the top of my head, the only thing they genuinely really expanded on was some of the skills available to your player, but also the jetpack, which was a lot more freeform, and then after the game was over, you got to use it freely, sort of Superman style. But that was really pretty much it. It is one of the rare cases where I would say Elex 2 was, in almost every way that matters, a worse game than the first one. But coming in at number 3, we then have what I'm sure will wind up being a slightly controversial one, which is GoW Ragnarok. Now, I will say straight away, Ragnarok is one of those games that I mentioned at the beginning that I don't think this game is bad at all. Quite the opposite. I think it's a very good game, actually. But I also, at the same time, don't think that it's nearly as good as the first one was. Now, I've heard some rumors, I don't know how true they are, that apparently they were going to try to do a trilogy for these at first, but then they decided to cram what was going to be 2 games into the 1 game with Ragnarok, and that's why some of like the story pacing and whatnot is weird, which certainly makes a certain degree of sense, and maybe that's true, but, you know, in any event, for me at least, Ragnarok, unfortunately, for a lot of story and pacing reasons especially, just doesn't quite land as well as the original game did. And as a result of that, GoW Ragnarok is great, but the first one is frankly better. Coming in at number 4, however, we then have something a little less controversial, which is Fables 2 or 3, really, take your pick. Both of them pale in comparison to the first Fable. Now, very recently, last year, I went through all 3 of the Fable games. They're very short, mostly to refresh my memory before 2025 here, where we're supposed to be getting some more news about the Fable reboot, so I could kind of remember what that was all about, because my general memory was that 1 was my favorite and I didn't care as much for the other 2, which is definitely what held true when I went back through them. Now, 3 in general, I wouldn't exactly say is beloved, but most people enjoy 2 and at least some of the changes it brought to the series. And while I can appreciate how Fable 2 expanded things like the real estate system as an example, it also fundamentally changed the magic and combat systems that I really enjoyed from the first game as well. And it's unfortunate for me, especially when you look at Fable 1's like boasting challenges and how you could handle quests and do various sides of them from the Heroes Guild and even some of the lore around that all of that was unfortunately sort of lost in the mix there, especially as they started moving towards the industrial age in those games. And don't even get me started on how playing 2 and 3, especially if you're on PC, is a real nightmare, and that 1 remains the only game that is readily available. And thus, Fable 1, while admittedly not exactly an incredible game all on its own, is still, in my opinion, better than 2 and 3 at the very least. Which I think will make for an especially interesting conversation around the Fable reboot, because I mean, realistically, clearing the bar of the first 3 games is not exactly a tall order. I think that bar is pretty low if we're being honest with ourselves. And so I think how that reboot does will likely not so much be about what that game is in comparison to these original ones, but rather, is it simply a good game on its own merits? But that does bring us to our final entry here, and this is actually Dying Light 2. So it's been a little while, so people might not remember, but this is another game that I really felt didn't live up to its potential. Now, I will say this game has gotten a fair few updates since I played it last. One thing I will say very positively about Techland is that they certainly support their games well into the future after they launch them. Now, I will say some of that comes with cosmetic skins where they're just trying to make money off of it, so you give a little, you get a little, but Dying Light 1 was a very unique experience. Now, technically, there were some RPG systems at play there, but especially with DLC like The Following and how honestly terrifying nighttime could be, alongside a really great melee system, you then have Dying Light 2. Dying Light 2, I think, unfortunately, also not really being a bad game at the same time, mind you, just doesn't live up to the first one in the sense that they turned a lot of it into like just straight up RPG stuff, where there's very clear stats, and once you've got a feel for that and the game's parkour system, even things like nighttime just don't even really feel like they pose much of a threat. Now, they try to get around some of that, or at least at the time I played it, by removing your guns. So Dying Light 1 had guns, this one does not. So in that way, it could kind of feel like a step back for sure. And what's more, the story honestly wasn't exactly great either. It tended to be a little too convoluted for its own good. Now, I will give Dying Light 2 one thing. I actually did enjoy the parkour a lot more in this one. Parkour was a big part of the first one as well, and it was honestly pretty good there, but in Dying Light 2, it did genuinely feel better, especially once you got a feel for the movement system. You could really just sort of get to moving, and that movement itself felt a lot better than the first one. So I'll give Dying Light 2 that part of it all day long. But that said, Dying Light 2 right now is actually on a pretty steep sail, and with all those updates, this might actually be a game that I take a look back on just here before too long, because as I mentioned, it's been a while since I've seen it with all the updates. Maybe my information is woefully out of date there. Maybe a second look would be fun. So if something like that interests you, by all means, leave that down in the comments section below. And while you're at it, perhaps like and subscribe as well, because I think that's pretty much where we're going to wrap up this particular video. So I hope you enjoyed it, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.